The stranger wasn't moving. That was the first thing Clara noticed when she stepped out onto the porch that morning, coffee tin still warm in her hand. The sun hadn't cleared the ridge yet, and the world was caught in that strange violet hour where shadows stretched long and the air tasted like iron and dust. She'd been up since before first light, same as always, because sleep had become a luxury she couldn't afford, not since Jacob died and left her alone on this God-forsaken strip of land with nothing but debts and silence. But this morning, something was different. The shape lay crumpled near the fence line, about 50 yards out. At first, she thought it might be a coyote, or maybe one of the calves that had wandered off during the night. But when the wind shifted and she squinted through the dim light, she saw the dark spread of fabric, the unnatural angle of limbs. A person. Clara set the tin down on the porch rail, her hands suddenly unsteady. Her first instinct was to go back inside, bolt the door, pretend she hadn't seen anything. Out here, trouble didn't knock. It just showed up bleeding in your yard and expected you to deal with it. But she didn't move. Instead, she stood there, gripping the rail, staring at the motionless figure. The morning was so quiet she could hear her own heartbeat thrumming in her ears. No birds, no wind, just that awful, oppressive stillness that made her skin prickle. Walk away, she told herself. This isn't your problem. But even as she thought it, her feet were already moving. She crossed the yard slowly, eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of riders or movement. Nothing. Just the empty stretch of scrubland and the jagged silhouette of the mountains in the distance. When she reached the figure, she crouched down, breath shallow. It was a man, young, maybe mid-20s, with dark hair matted to his forehead and a face so pale it looked like he'd already crossed over. His shirt was soaked through with blood, the fabric torn open across his side where something, bullet knife, she couldn't tell, had ripped through him. His breathing was shallow, barely there. Clara pressed 2 fingers to his neck, pulse, weak but present. She exhaled, cursing under her breath. Leave him. Let someone else find him. This isn't your fight. But she couldn't. God help her. She couldn't. She hooked her arms under his shoulders and dragged him toward the barn. He was heavier than he looked, dead weight, and by the time she got him inside and onto the pile of hay in the corner, her arms were shaking and her dress was streaked with dirt and blood. She knelt beside him, pushing the hair back from his face. He didn't wake, didn't flinch. Clara worked fast, fetching water and clean rags from the house, tearing strips of linen to bind the wound. It was deep, too deep, but the bleeding had slowed, which meant either his body was starting to clot or he was running out of blood to lose. She poured whiskey over the gash, and this time he did react, a low groan escaping his lips as his body jerked. "Easy," she murmured, pressing the cloth against his side. "Easy now." His eyes fluttered open just for a second, dark and unfocused, searching her face like he was trying to decide if she was real or some fever dream. Then they closed again, and he went still. Clara sat back on her heels, staring at him. "What have you done?" She didn't know who he was. Didn't know what he'd done or who might be looking for him. All she knew was that if someone came asking, and they found him here, she'd be the one who paid for it. But it was too late now. She covered him with a blanket, stood, and walked back to the house. The coffee was cold, the sun was up. And somewhere out there, someone was looking for the man bleeding in her barn. By the time she reached the porch, she could already feel it, the weight of the choice she'd just made, settling over her shoulders like stones. The rest of the day passed in a fog of chores and glances over her shoulder. Clara fed the chickens, mended the fence where it had come loose, hauled water from the creek. Normal tasks, routine. But every few minutes she found herself stopping, listening, waiting for the sound of hoofbeats or voices. Nothing came. By late afternoon she returned to the barn. He was awake, not fully, his eyes were half-lidded, glassy, but aware enough to track her movement as she approached. He tried to sit up, winced, and collapsed back into the hay. "Don't," Clara said, kneeling beside him. "You'll tear the stitches." He stared at her, confusion flickering across his face. "Who? Doesn't matter." She pressed a hand to his chest, keeping him down. "You were bleeding out in my yard. I patched you up. That's all you need to know." He swallowed, his throat working like the words were stuck. "Why?" "Don't know yet," she said quietly. "Maybe I'm a fool." His gaze held hers for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. Then he closed them again, his breathing evening out. Clara stood, wiping her hands on her apron. "There's water beside you. Don't try to move, and don't make me regret this." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "They'll come looking." She froze, her back still to him. "Who?" "Doesn't matter," he said, echoing her own words. "But when they do, you tell them you never saw me." Clara didn't turn around. She just nodded once and walked out of the barn, the door creaking shut behind her. And as the sun dipped low behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire, she stood on her porch and stared out at the empty horizon, waiting. By the second morning, the stranger had a name. "Call me Elias," he'd said the night before, his voice still rough but stronger than it had been. He'd managed to sit up, his back against the barn wall, and though the colour hadn't fully returned to his face, his eyes were clearer, sharper. Clara had brought him soup, thin broth with bits of potato and dried meat, and watched as he ate slowly, methodically, like a man who'd learned not to waste anything. "Elias," she repeated, testing the name. "That your real name?" He looked at her over the rim of the bowl. "Does it matter?" "I suppose not." But it did, because a name meant a story, and a story meant complications, and Clara had enough of those already. She sat across from him on an overturned crate, arms folded over her knees. "You said they'd come looking. Who's they?" Elias set the bowl down, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. For a moment, he didn't answer, just stared at the barn door like he could see through it, out into the world beyond. "Men," he said finally. "The kind who don't ask questions before they shoot. Outlaws. Lawmen." Clara's stomach dropped. "You're running from the law?" "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to." Elias leaned his head back against the wall, exhaling slowly. "I was in the wrong place. Saw the wrong thing. And now they want to make sure I don't talk about it." "What did you see?" "Nothing you want to know about." Clara stood, pacing the small space of the barn. Her mind was racing, trying to calculate the risk, the cost, the consequences. If lawmen came here and found him, she'd be an accomplice. They'd take her land or worse, and if they didn't find him but word got out that she'd helped him. She stopped, turning to face him. "Why should I believe you?" "You shouldn't," Elias said simply. "But you're still here." He was right. She could have turned him in already. Could have ridden into town yesterday and told the sheriff she'd found an injured man on her property. Let them deal with it. Wash her hands of the whole mess. But she hadn't. Because there was something about the way he looked at her, not with desperation or manipulation, but with a kind of quiet resignation, like he'd already accepted whatever was coming. And maybe that was why she stayed, because she knew that look. She'd worn it herself after Jacob died, when the debts piled up and the neighbors stopped coming by, and she realized no one was going to save her. "How long before they get here?" she asked. "Day, maybe 2. Clara nodded slowly. "Then you need to be gone by tomorrow night." "I can't ride yet." "You'll have to." Elias met her gaze, and for the first time she saw something that might have been gratitude, or maybe just relief. "Thank you," he said quietly. Clara didn't respond. She just turned and walked out of the barn, pulling the door shut behind her. By midday, the first sign of trouble arrived. Clara was in the garden pulling weeds when she heard the sound of hooves. She straightened, shading her eyes against the sun, and saw 2 riders approaching from the east. Her pulse quickened. Lawmen. She wiped her hands on her apron, forced her expression into something neutral, and walked toward the fence. The men reined in their horses just outside the gate. Both wore tin stars pinned to their vests, and both had the hard, weathered look of men who'd spent too much time chasing ghosts through the desert. "Ma'am," the older one said, tipping his hat. He had a thick grey moustache and eyes like flint. "Sorry to trouble you. We're looking for a man. Young fella, dark hair, might be injured." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her face calm. "Haven't seen anyone like that." The younger lawman leaned forward in his saddle, scanning the property. "You sure? We got word he was headed this direction." "I'm sure," Clara said evenly. "It's just me out here. Haven't had a visitor in weeks." The older man studied her for a long moment, his gaze sharp and assessing. "Mind if we take a look around?" Clara's mind raced. If they searched the barn, it was over, but if she refused, they'd know something was wrong. "Look all you want," she said, stepping aside and gesturing toward the property. "Like I said, there's no one here but me." The 2 men exchanged a glance, then dismounted. Clara's hands trembled as she led them toward the house, praying that Elias had the sense to stay quiet. They checked the house first, quick, efficient, opening doors and peering into corners. Then they moved to the barn. Clara's breath caught as the older lawman pushed the door open, sunlight spilling into the dim interior. He stepped inside. Clara stood in the doorway, her nails digging into her palms. The lawman walked the length of the barn, eyes sweeping over the stalls, the hay, the tools hanging on the wall. He stopped near the corner where Elias had been lying just hours before. For a moment, Clara thought she saw something flicker in his expression, suspicion maybe. But then he turned and walked back toward her. "Nothing here?" he said. Clara exhaled slowly. The younger lawman frowned. "You sure, Frank?" "I'm sure," Frank said, mounting his horse. He looked down at Clara one last time. "If you do see him, ma'am, you let us know. Man's dangerous." Clara nodded. "I will." The 2 men rode off, dust rising in their wake. Clara stood there until they disappeared over the ridge, her legs shaking so badly she thought she might collapse. When she finally turned back toward the barn, she saw Elias standing in the shadows near the back wall, half hidden behind a pile of crates. "You moved," she said. "Had to." "If they'd seen you—" "They didn't." Clara pressed a hand to her chest, trying to steady her breathing. "You need to leave. Tonight." Elias nodded. "I know." But neither of them moved. They just stood there, staring at each other across the dim barn, the weight of what had almost happened hanging heavy in the air. And somewhere in the distance, the sound of hoofbeats faded into silence. The night fell fast and cold. Clara sat on the porch, a rifle across her lap, eyes fixed on the dark line of the horizon. Elias was in the barn, packing what little he had: water, dried meat, a blanket she'd given him. He'd insisted he could ride, though she could see the pain in the way he moved, the careful way he held his side. She didn't know if he'd make it, didn't know if he'd even make it past the ridge before collapsing. But that wasn't her problem anymore. That's what you keep telling yourself. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint smell of smoke. Clara's head snapped up. She stood, scanning the darkness, her grip tightening on the rifle. There, off to the south, a faint orange glow. Fire. Her stomach twisted. Fires didn't start themselves out here, not in the dead of night. Someone had lit it. And if someone had lit it, they were close. Clara ran to the barn, throwing the door open. "Elias." He was already on his feet, eyes locked on hers. "I saw it." "They're coming." "I know." Clara's mind raced. If they ran, the riders would see them. If they stayed, they'd be trapped. There was no good option. "How many?" Elias asked. "I don't know. More than 2. Elias cursed under his breath, pressing a hand to his side. He looked pale again, the color drained from his face. "You need to get out of here. This is my land, and it'll be your grave if you stay." Clara didn't respond. She just walked to the barn door and peered out into the darkness. The fire was closer now, and she could hear them, voices low and sharp, cutting through the night. "They're not lawmen," she said quietly. "No," Elias agreed. "They're not." Clara turned to face him. "What did you see? What did you do that made them come after you like this?" Elias hesitated, his jaw tight. Then, finally, he spoke. "There was a robbery, a stagecoach, 3 weeks back. The men who did it were wearing badges." Clara's blood ran cold. "Lawmen?" "Corrupt ones," Elias said. "They killed the driver, took the money, and pinned it on some drifters. I was there. I saw the whole thing. And when I tried to report it, they came after me." "Why didn't you run?" "I did." He gestured to the wound on his side. "This is what running gets you." Clara stared at him, her mind spinning. If what he was saying was true, then the men outside weren't just outlaws, they were lawmen, which meant no one would believe her if she tried to turn them in. And if they found Elias here, they'd kill him. And probably her too. The voices were louder now, closer. Clara could see the flicker of torchlight through the cracks in the barn wall. "They're going to burn it down," she said, her voice flat. Elias nodded. "Probably." Clara looked around the barn, at the hay, the dry wood, the years of her life packed into this small, fragile space. Everything she had left of Jacob was here. The tools he'd used, the saddle he'd ridden, the initials he'd carved into the support beam, JM plus CL. She closed her eyes, just for a moment. Then she made her choice. "There's a root cellar," she said. "Under the house. You can hide there." "Clara, go." She grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the door. "Now!" They ran through the darkness, low and fast, Clara leading the way. She could hear the riders circling the property, their voices sharp with anticipation. When they reached the house, she threw open the cellar door and shoved Elias inside. "Don't come out," she said, "no matter what you hear." "Clara." She slammed the door shut and bolted it. Then she turned and walked back outside, rifle in hand, just as the riders came into view. There were 5 of them, all armed, all wearing the same cold, predatory expression. The man in front, the one Clara recognized as Frank, the older lawman from earlier, reined in his horse and smiled. "Thought you said you hadn't seen anyone," he said. Clara raised the rifle, aiming it at his chest. "Get off my land," Frank laughed. "Now, ma'am, there's no need for that. We're just here to collect what's ours." "He's not here?" "Then you won't mind if we take a look?" "I do mind." Frank's smile faded. "Put the rifle down, ma'am. You don't want to make this harder than it has to be." Clara's hands were steady. Her voice was steady. "Leave," she said, "or I'll shoot." For a moment, no one moved. The night was silent except for the crackle of the torches and the low, rhythmic breathing of the horses. Then Frank sighed, shaking his head. "Burn it," he said. And the world erupted into fire. The first torch hit the barn. Clara watched as the flames caught, spreading fast across the dry wood and hay. The heat hit her face like a slap, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. Then she pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, sharp and loud, and Frank's horse reared. The other riders scattered, cursing, pulling their own weapons. Clara fired again, then dove behind the water trough as bullets tore through the air above her. "You're making a mistake," Frank shouted. Clara didn't answer. She reloaded, hands shaking, and fired again. One of the riders yelped, clutching his arm, but there were too many of them, and she was out of bullets. She crouched behind the trough, heart hammering, waiting for the end. And then, from somewhere behind the house, she heard a new sound. Hoofbeats, not the riders, something else. The shooting stopped. Frank and his men turned, confusion flickering across their faces. A lone rider emerged from the darkness, coming fast. Clara couldn't see his face, but she saw the rifle in his hands, saw the way he rode, low and hard, like a man who'd done this before. He fired once, twice, 3 times. 2 of Frank's men went down. The others scrambled, shouting, trying to return fire. But the rider was too fast, too precise. Frank cursed, yanking his horse around. "Fall back!" The riders retreated, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as they'd come. The lone rider slowed, circling the property once before coming to a stop in front of Clara. He dismounted, and in the flickering firelight, she finally saw his face. It was Elias. Clara stared at him, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. "I told you to stay. I don't follow orders well," he said, offering her a hand. She took it, letting him pull her to her feet. Her legs were shaking so badly she could barely stand. "You shouldn't have come back," she said. "You shouldn't have saved me," he replied. Clara looked at the barn. The fire was still burning, but slower now, the worst of it already consumed. Everything she'd fought to keep was turning to ash. Elias followed her gaze. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Clara didn't respond. She just stood there, watching the flames, feeling the heat on her face, and the cold emptiness settling into her chest. "They'll come back," Elias said. "I know." "You can't stay here." "I know that too." Elias turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. "Come with me." Clara blinked, startled. "What?" "Come with me," he said again. "There's a town, 3 days' ride west. People there who can help. People who will believe what I saw. I can't just leave." "There's nothing left here," Elias said gently. "And if you stay, they'll kill you." Clara looked at him, really looked at him, at the man she'd dragged out of the dust, the man who'd lied and bled, and now stood in front of her, offering her the only thing he had left to give. A way out. She thought of Jacob, of the life they'd built here, the dreams they'd buried in this land, of the mornings she'd spent alone, the nights she'd spent wondering if she'd ever feel like herself again. And then she thought of the fire, the riders, the cold certainty that if she stayed, she'd die here alone and forgotten. "All right," she said. Elias's eyes widened. "You mean it?" "I mean it." He nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Then we better move. They won't stay gone for long." Clara turned toward the house, what was left of it, and walked inside. She grabbed what little she could carry, a photograph of Jacob, a blanket, a tin of coffee. Then she walked out, closed the door behind her, and didn't look back. Elias helped her onto the horse, then climbed up behind her. The fire was still burning in the distance, casting long shadows across the land. "You ready?" he asked. Clara took a deep breath. "Yeah," she said, "I'm ready." And together they rode into the darkness. 3 days later they reached the town. It was small, just a handful of buildings clustered around a dusty main street, but it felt like salvation. Clara had barely slept during the ride, every sound making her jump, every shadow making her reach for the rifle. But Elias had been steady, guiding them through the desert with the quiet confidence of someone who knew how to survive. They rode straight to the sheriff's office. The man behind the desk was older, grey-haired, with tired eyes that had seen too much. But when Elias told his story, slowly, carefully, leaving nothing out, the sheriff listened. And when Elias was done, the sheriff nodded. "I've heard rumors," he said, "about Frank and his crew. Didn't have proof. But this—" He looked at Clara. "You're willing to testify?" Clara hesitated. Then she nodded. "I am." The sheriff stood, pulling his coat from the back of his chair. "Then let's get to work." It took 2 weeks to bring Frank and his men in. 2 weeks of waiting, of testimony, of sleepless nights and whispered conversations. But in the end, justice came. Frank and 3 of his men were arrested, tried, and sentenced. The others scattered, disappearing into the desert like ghosts. Clara stayed in the town. She rented a small room above the general store, found work helping the shopkeeper with inventory. It wasn't the life she'd imagined, but it was a life. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could breathe. Elias stayed too. He didn't talk much about what came next, whether he'd move on, find somewhere new to disappear. But he stayed. And every evening he'd come by the store, help Clara close up, and walk her back to her room. One night, as they stood on the porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains, Clara spoke. "Why did you come back?" she asked. "That night, when I told you to stay hidden." Elias was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Because you didn't have to help me. And when someone does something like that, when they risk everything for a stranger, you don't forget it. Clara looked at him. You would have done the same. Maybe, Elias said, but you did it first. They stood there in silence, the sky turning gold and red and finally deep purple. And for the first time since Jacob died, Clara felt something close to peace. Years later, Clara would remember that night. The night she dragged a bleeding stranger out of the dust and made a choice that changed everything. She'd think about the fire, the riders, the way Elias had come back for her when he could have just run. She'd think about how close she'd come to losing everything, and how, in the end, losing everything had saved her. Elias stayed. They never talked about it in grand terms, never made promises they couldn't keep, but he stayed. And slowly, quietly, they built something new. Not the life she'd had with Jacob that was gone, buried with him in the dust, but something different, something that felt like a second chance. The town grew, new families arrived, new businesses opened. Clara eventually bought the general store, ran it herself. Elias took work as a deputy, helping the sheriff keep the peace. And on quiet evenings, when the sun dipped low and the world turned soft and golden, they'd sit on the porch together, watching the horizon. Clara never went back to her old land. The fire had taken the barn, and the house had collapsed not long after. But sometimes, when the wind blew just right, she swore she could still smell the smoke. And she'd remember the morning she found a stranger bleeding in the dust, the morning everything changed. Fade out on, the sun setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the empty desert. Clara standing on the porch, a cup of coffee in her hand, Elias beside her. The faint sound of laughter from inside the house. The quiet promise of tomorrow. And somewhere, far out in the wilderness, the wind carrying the ghosts of the past away into the endless, forgiving dark.